Okay, we've got linear regression. We're going to try to do this video with the smart board going on here, or whatever we call this view board. Um, so you should have this sheet. Can you predict SAT from GPA? This is a really good review. I'm going to tell you this stuff will be on the AP exam. So you want to make sure that you study this stuff. Every student I've got should be able to get stuff off this one. Okay, is it a positive or negative relationship? We, of course, are looking at this line here, and we find that it is positive. And you need to be able to explain what positive is. We see as we go across, as X increases, or GPA, as GPA increases, SAT, which is Y, increases. Know the difference between positive and negative. If you have to explain it, you would explain that, positive and negative, if it's negative, as GPA increases, SAT decreases. Are there any unusual features in the scatter plot? No outliers. Not much more of an explanation for this. What is the form? The best form, as we're looking at these, overall, I would say this thing, it models a line. Okay, and what is the strength? Now, the strength is R, and that's correlation. Okay, so we have to go back in terms of strength. There are four things that we're actually studying, and I kind of jumped ahead a little bit, so I want to get these on here. But there's an acronym that I gave you at the start of the year, and that acronym is FUDS. Okay, and we're talking about all those things. So over here, I would give yourself a little bit of room. F stands for form. We just talked about it being a linear form. Okay, that's number 3. And U is unusual features. And those are the outliers. And I don't think there's any outliers. There's nothing here that overall sticks out. D is direction. And the direction, it's a positive direction. It's either going to be positive or it's going to be negative. And then S stands for strength. And we got to have some rules for our strength. So I'm gonna page down here. We've got some kind of notes that we've got. So here's an important idea that we could put in our notes. And in terms of R, if the absolute value of R is greater than 0.75, we say that's strong. It can be positive, it can be negative. If R is less than 75, but bigger than or equal to 30, we've usually said that's moderate. And then if the absolute value of R is less than 30, we say it's weak. Okay. By the way, no homework. You can do that if you want, but it's optional, but we don't actually do the homework ones. But in terms of our strength, now let's come back. Excuse me, sorry. I've been fighting a cold. I'm probably going to have to cough once in a while. But what is our strength? So up here, we're going to have to look. It says R squared is 778. Remember, we will never use R squared adjusted. If it happens, if you want to look up what is R squared adjusted, feel free. You can do that as extra review or something. You can search that online, but I don't teach that. And in the event it burns us on the AP test, my apologies in advance. but r squared is 77.8. So first, when you write that down, you want to turn it to a decimal, 0.778, and then you want to take the square root. The problem is, remember, when you take a square root, you're going to get 0.882 in the calculator, but is it positive or negative? You have to know a way to look at it. When you look back at the line, it was positive, so that should be positive. There's a second way. If you wouldn't have a graph, you should be able to look. Remember your coefficients. This is A and this is B. Your slope, B is 169. Your slope is positive, so it has to be the positive value. You never put that it's positive and negative 0.882. That would be a wrong answer. It cannot be both. So don't put that, but you have to remember that it could be one or the other. So a lot of times on the AP test, they put a negative graph on here, and if you don't get that negative, you're going to get that wrong. All right, so now the summary, describe the relationship. This is the FUDs in context. So the association between GPA and SAT. There's your context. On the AP exam for the free response questions, remember that you have to do things in context. Sorry, the lighting's a little bit bad. This is actually where the lighting's pretty good. So remember, do things in context. The context is always in the question. So the association between GPA and SAT is strong. And I actually didn't finish number 4. This is 0.882, which would be a strong relationship because that's above the 0.75 value that we had in there. So it's strong, positive, linear, and no apparent outliers. This is a great question to review. It's been on the AP test quite a bit, and it appears on there quite often. Okay, what is the equation of the least squares regression line? Now your formula sheet, make sure you print a formula sheet, and on the AP exam, when you get your exam in the first pages, you'll find that they have a formula sheet. You'll get a packet like this. It usually looks like this, and the formula sheets are in there, but it will be the updated formula sheet. Okay, and I've got the updated formula sheet in your review. It's online. If you, for some reason, can't find it, email me and I'll send it to you. Okay, so one of the things, the equation for the least squares line on the formula sheet is y hat equals a plus bx. So you should be able to figure out x and y by looking at this thing. SAT is y, GPA is x. Remember, this thing that says constant, you never use it. X always appears in here, and it goes A, B, and X. The right side of the equation is always in there. You've got A, B, and X. So Y, which is SAT, I'm going to scribble that out. SAT hat equals 724.4 plus 169 times GPA. Write it in context. I'm going to go a little out of order with this one, and I'm going to jump down here. It says predict the score for a student with a GPA of 3.4. So right away, I can take that equation, SAT equals 774.4. Make sure I got that right. It's not ringing right in my head. 724.4. plus 169 times 3.4. If you get something like this on the AP test, make sure that you show your work. Type that in the way you see it. Sorry, I can't get the right angle. My sunlight is goofing me up on here. All right, but you should get 1,299. Now we'll come back to that one, but we want to finish this other page. It says interpret the slope. Remember the slope. The slope is the y's over the x's. It's the rise over the run. Y is SAT and X is GPA. If you do not study this, you're not going to get it right. You got to make sure you study this stuff. It's important. Everybody, you can do this stuff. I'm positive in that. So it's 169 is the slope. The B value is the slope over 1. So you get the words I predict or we predict. We predict 169 more SAT points for 1 more GPA. Hopefully that rings a bell. This is something you can study. My advice on the AP exam, when I'm going through this, you're supposed to do all the reviews. You do the reviews. You find the ones you can really do, and you relearn that stuff. If it's confusing and I go through it and you're just going through the motions, we're doing some probability, and you do the probability and you don't know it, it's fine. Remaster the stuff you do well. Practice what you know well. This is a sheet everybody should practice. And if you don't know it, practice it again. Now, what's the y-intercept? Remember the y-intercept, if you take the equation, which is this, 724.4 plus 169 times the GPA. You're going to put in 0 for the GPA. Now, if you do that and you talk it through, if GPA equals 0, we predict 724.4 on the SAT. Okay? Now let's come back to this one. These two would be a two-part question on the AP exam. Number 8 would go with number 9. The student had a GPA of 3.4. Now this one actually, many times on the AP test, you can see it. I'm going to have an announcement going over the thing here. I'm trying to drown it out. So, okay. So 3.4, this is the student. They scored 1,113. But what we predicted was up here at 1299. That's the one we did in number 8. Okay, so your residual formula is E equals Y minus Y hat. Remember, like with the the formula for the z-score, you always subtract the mean. The line is the mean. So for a residual, you would take what the student actually did, 1,113, and subtract 1,299, because this is the prediction. The 1,299 is the prediction. And you subtract that, you're going to get negative 186. Now, what does that tell us? How do we interpret it? The student scored $186 less than predicted. And you can see it when you look at the graph. When you look at the graph, the student scored lower than predicted. Okay, got an extra thing in there. Let's see if I can get that out of there. All right. What does the residual plot indicate? You notice there's a residual plot on this second page right here, and they're random. So the random residuals indicate the linear model is good. Okay, now if you remember, it'd be stuff like Curved residuals, that's a bad model because if we make predictions way out there, they're not going to be accurate. But random residuals, when you extrapolate, you're going to get potentially better predictions. Now, this next one, I usually don't teach this. I mentioned it one time in a video, but the standard deviation of the residuals. It did appear on the AP exam one time. Standard deviation of the residuals is 116.9. Here's the simple solution. What is standard deviation? Standard deviation is the average measure of spread. So the average measure of spread for the residuals is, I forgot it already, 116.9. I had it, I just didn't trust myself. All right, number 12, R squared. You should know how to do R squared, but I'll go through it again. If you did the My Math Lab for the last one, it has a couple R squareds on there that you should have done. But R squared, the basic sentence you need to rememorize, R squared percent of the variation in Y is explained by X. Okay, so how should I do that one in this problem? It should be 77.8%. I'm going to do dittos of the variation in SAT is explained by GPA. Okay, last problem. The last one deals with chapter 26. It's the linear regression t-test. Now, I don't usually do the assumptions. So on this one, do the data provide convincing evidence? You want to pause the video now. You want to practice a linear regression t-test? You can. But here we go. The null. B equals 0. It says, is it positive? So B is greater than 0. B is the slope for GPA and SAT. Okay, we're going to run a linear regression t-test. Since this is 0, we can go up here and we have our t-score, but we don't actually have our p-value. We're going to have to find that, even though it's related to that p-value. T is 5.29. Now, how do I get my p-value? I'm going to draw a little curve here. And we're at 5.29, and we're only worried about greater than. Okay, so I'm going to have to bring up my calculator, which I forgot to pull up. So pardon me on the, whoops. Computer's up here. I'm walking all over the room, but it's right here. So now one simple way, that p-value they gave us is 0.001. You could divide it by 2 because that in the table is always the two-tailed, it's always the two-tailed p-value. Okay, so if we divide it by 2, we'd get 0.005, but it's 0.005, but it's not quite accurate. So we're going to get the better accurate value if my Inspire calculator will hurry up. You have to do the TCDF. And I don't know if my calculator, there we go, finally. Okay, so we'll get a calculator page. Now, depending on if you're using the TI-84, that's another thing. But if you're using this one, you're going menu 6.5. We got to get TCDF. So if you're using the 84, you got to find the TCDF. And we got our lower bound of the 5.29. Our upper bound is 999. Now, our degrees of freedom are 8. I'll explain how I know our degrees of freedom are 8 in a second. And we get 0.0003. Actually 0.0004 if we round it. So this is 0.0004. Now, how do I know the degrees of freedom? We go back to the original. We count the dots. There's 10 dots. And remember, degrees of freedom are n. Can't get the right thing. N minus 2. So it should be 8 degrees of freedom. All right. So to close this session out, 0.004 is less than 5%. So remember, less than, you reject the null, and you have evidence that the slope is positive or that b is greater than 0. Now be careful on the AP test with the b is greater than 0. If you're doing the abbreviation, as long as you've defined b, you'll be okay with that. But that ends this review session. Nothing else to do. Hopefully you remember that stuff. And like I said, review the stuff you know. This is all stuff everybody should be able to know. 99% of this. Even the standard error of the residuals, you could probably figure that out. So thanks for watching.